We urge you ask questions as and when they occur so that there is not a bottleneck at the end. Now, over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome to all our participants from around the UK and the United States, and often from other parts of the world as well. Happy to talk about this very interesting and always current question with a particularly distinguished group of panelists. I want to introduce Catherine Pepinster, who is a British journalist, author, and broadcaster. She's been a senior national newspaper executive, edited at Catholic Weekly for 13 years, and regularly broadcasts for the BBC. Kate Ruan directs the Free Expression Project of the Center for Democracy and Technology here in Washington, D.C. She's an attorney with a strong background in legal research and is particularly interested in the way that strong protections for free expression benefit communities of color and others that are often censored and little listened to. John Watson is an associate professor in the School of Communication at American University, a journalist, also has a law degree and a PhD as well. His research on media law and journalism ethics is frequently presented at conferences and in his writings. John Drakakis is what used to be known as a gentleman of letters. He is from Scotland, works in Scotland at the University of Stirling, emeritus professor there actually, and holds a PhD as well. He is interested in Shakespearean and Jacobean literature and other matters that often were the subject of censorship in years gone by. I want to begin by turning to John Watson, and we've agreed we have a lot of Johns here today, so we're going to use last names only. So Watson, I wonder if you could get us started by talking about shifting definitions of the term censorship and whether it means the same thing it once did and is as taboo as many people think it ought to be. You're on mute, John.
Historically, censorship has always meant restrictions on speech we don't like. Okay, so those of us who were capable of issuing those restrictions never considered it censorship. We considered it editing, for example. When I was a reporter, all my editors censored me. When I became an editor, I edited reporters. I never censored them. So censorship is a term of condemnation, and it changes based on who is using the word. But in the United States, for example, there's like a theological attachment to the word freedom of speech. And censorship is the antithesis of that. So it generally frames our discussion of this entire issue of different restrictions and encouragements for speech.
And is there a new resort to censorship given the fact that much protest these days seems to offend people and produce a very, very strong reaction of injury, hurt, upset sometimes?
Well, censorship becomes an issue as a society's values begin to change, because speech that one portion of society that is battling for dominance or preeminence will conflict with the other side. Like currently in the United States, there's a great deal of conflict over our changing moral, social, and political values. And each side wants to claim they are fighting censorship. And as a result, the concept of censorship becomes combative, even though the meaning, in my opinion, hasn't changed ever from the first censorious issue arising in civilization.
Catherine Pepinster, in the UK, and please remember to unmute yourself. Thank you. In the UK, there's been quite a lot of controversy recently over censorship, as I understand it, and some question whether one political force is using it against another, and some new laws that appear to some people as just a way to constrain protest. Is that a fair evaluation?
Yes, those kinds of arguments are going on. If I could just pick up on something that John Watson was just saying, because I think that there's something very interesting going on with censorship at the moment. So if we go back to the 1960s, and you had people who were trying to push the boundaries of, say, what was described in the written word or on the stage or in television or film. A lot of this was about the way in which sex was conveyed. The people who would push the boundaries were seen as progressive, and the people who were seen as wanting to restrict things was seen as very conservative. We're now in a situation with something such as the issues over trans, where I think something quite different is going on, so that people who want to push the boundaries want to actually shut down other voices against pushing the boundaries, whereas in the past, the trying to shut down the voices came from those who didn't want the boundaries pushed. I don't know if I'm explaining this right, but I think there's a difference in the kind of way in which censorship is being, the activists are dealing with it.
Kate Rowan, how would you compare trends in the United States to this? Censorship is a word that is definitely attached to politics one way or another. In your efforts to protect the voices of minorities and dissenting communities, how does censorship come into play?
I think I've heard a lot of really interesting things and really interesting concepts so far. One thing I want to draw out is one of the big questions when it comes to censorship is who is doing the censoring.
Of course.
I think that there are much bigger concerns when it is the government deciding, whatever government entity, deciding what people can or cannot say. And I think that is some of what we're seeing when we talk about student protests, right? It is when the government comes in the form of the police or in the form of the public university to stop the protesters from speaking, that we have the clearest evidence that censorship is ongoing. But another kind of situation in which we see in which we see debates about content or the type or speech that should or should not be suppressed is on social media, for example, where people talk about the content moderation policies of social media companies, and content moderation policies are those companies making their rules about what can and cannot be said on their services, and whether those policies and the ways in which they are enforced are censoring or disfavoring particular views. That is also an interesting debate, and one that we should have and discuss, and I think is incredibly important, because many of the systems of content moderation that currently exist can reinforce some existing biases within speech environments where Black people, LGBTQ people can often find themselves disproportionately censored within those systems. But at the same time, you also have other groups claiming that their views are also being censored by these platforms. So that's kind of another kind of sphere in which this debate is is occurring. I'm not sure if that specifically answers your question about the United States versus other places. I do think that this is happening everywhere, and the one thing that I really think makes a giant difference in terms of whether this is a conversation that is about whether it is justified or not is whether it is the government doing it versus whether it is some private actor or private company or a private discussion wherein private individuals are trying to figure out what is appropriate to be said or not said in a particular space.
Right. I think that's a good point. Drakakis, are there similar trends in the British university system to the American one, where there are huge confrontations on college campuses, both public universities and private ones in this country, that have on many recent occasions actually interfered with the educational function of those institutions? And that's where the great recent controversy has arisen here. Is there a similar trend in the UK?
I'm not sure I would call it a trend. In some select universities, there seem to be protests, but nothing like the kind of protests that I've seen on TV coming from the States. I mean, students always protest in various ways. And it's become part of, student life in some respects. But can I come back to some of the issues raised? Because it seems to be that censorship is one thing, and that you either censor or you don't. Now, I think we need to think about how historically censorship has operated, how it's changed with the development of modern media, and what responsibilities or what freedoms the platforms that host some of these sort of sites have a responsibility to control the material that's being put out. Am I correct in thinking that there is very little control by these platforms?
I think that's correct. Certainly much less control than there was in
and
classically over literature in certain cities and states in the United States.
And how would that differ from should we say printed constraints? Restraints on the newspaper industry, what it can publish, what it can't publish. And I think the argument certainly in this country has been in part about whether these media platforms are in fact to be treated in the same way that publishers would be treated, or what would happen if, for example, the same rules governing publishing, print publishing, were to be applied to media platforms.
I would ask Kate or Watson to answer that question and compare what I would call classic censorship to current censorship today.
I'll jump in first. Classic censorship, I think we have to go back to the time of John Milton and John Stuart Mill. These were highly intellectual writers at a time where there was not widespread literacy. So they were a few people. And at that time, the focus was almost entirely on the content of the idea. These were people intellectually foisting new and, at that point, unacceptable ideas upon the clergy and the government. So the concept of censorship was finally refined to focus on ideas. But nowadays, as a result of technology, even the barely literate can reach millions of other people. So the concept of censorship is no longer simply focused on a clash of ideas, but on a clash of the manner that these ideas are expressed. The classical, I say, innovation in ideas came from people who were learned in the process of rational discussion and persuasion. But now, much of this comes from people who just have to be smart enough to press a few buttons. Also, it is not regulated, but it is made available to those people by people who are concerned only about making money. So they want as many voices using their platforms, irrespective of the message. And to protect this economic upward mobility, I should say simply the ability to make money, they claim a freedom to do so, and they decry censorship. So essentially, it's the same censorship as before, but to my view, it's censorship directed differently now than in the classical 14th, 15th century notion of censorship. And whether it's the government doing it, as Kate Rand said, it's very important to me. I see an absolute necessity to draw a line between public censorship by the government and private censorship by individuals and private businesses.
Kate?
In terms of the question that I think John Drakakis posed of like, what would happen if we impose the same laws on media platforms like social media companies as we do on traditional publishers? In the United States, we affirmatively do not do that. We have a law called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which says that interactive computer services, which encompasses social media services, cannot be treated as the publisher or speaker, or cannot be held liable as the publisher or speaker of information provided by somebody else. So information provided by the platform's users. Critically, this also applies to users themselves. Users also cannot be held liable for other people's content. So that means that if there's something illegal and something that you might reshare online that you didn't create yourself, you are also eligible for protection under Section 230. The reason that Section 230 exists is in part because when the internet was pretty nascent, two lawmakers took a look at it and took a look at how some of the case law around publisher liability for social media platforms was developing. And what they found was that social media platforms were being held liable for all of the content on their platforms when they engaged in attempts to moderate content, when they tried to get rid of either offensive content or illegal content, or when they tried to just create a service that was for one particular thing. Like if you wanted to have a knitting website and somebody came on and wanted to talk about car mechanics, if you engaged in content moderation to get rid of irrelevant stuff, then you could be liable for what your users posted that would be illegal. And what the lawmakers thought when they saw that was that would mean that these services, which are democratizing forces, allow anybody to share information online. These services would suddenly have to really slow down the publication of their content because they would have of user content, because they would have to investigate each of those individual millions, now billions per second of posts to decide whether it did or didn't pose some liability risk. And so what the lawmakers said back then was, actually, because we want this to be because we want the internet to be a place for free expression, we are going to say that the lawmakers that interactive computer services won't be liable as publishers for other people's content. They are still liable for their own content. They are still liable for their own illegal content and their own illegal conduct, but they are not liable as publishers of other people's content. If we just got rid of that, we would have some significant free expression problems on the internet, because what we know is platforms are going to want to avoid liability, and they will build censorship systems to try to avoid that legal liability. And those censorship systems will undoubtedly disproportionately harm controversial speech, speech that is legal but is disfavored by the government, speech that is, difficult to encounter for whatever reason, speech that pushes boundaries. That will be the speech that will be first on the chopping block. So that's one of the concerns that I have when we talk about getting rid of what we call, generally speaking, intermediary liability protections on the internet. There could be other ways to do it. I know that it is done differently in Europe, for example, under the DSA. There is a new regime that has just come into effect. We're going to see how that goes. But I do not think that we can necessarily. I do not think that it is good for free expression for us to remove some of those for us to just remove those intermediary liability protections and treat publishers online the same way that we treated publishers before the internet existed.
But this is a problem, isn't it? Because the laws that we have are applied then to platforms of one sort or another, and this is where the problems come in. We're always dragging our feet in legal terms, in the face of this. And let's be honest, I mean, those who operate platforms are interested in getting advertisers to pay them. That's their main reason for existing. And so the more advertisement they get, the better it is. Nobody bothers about censoring advertisements. You apply any system of truth to an advertisement and you're going to get into serious trouble, it seems to me. So, it's become a kind of a complete mess as far as I can see. And I'm not sure that, a historical view actually helps. I mean, my work is in the 16th century when there was censorship. It would be very difficult to tell what got censored because we don't have the information. I mean, we can speculate on the basis of comments that are made, but it's very, very difficult to determine what is actually censored, whether it's political censorship, religious censorship, or simply censoring people who say things that might offend other individuals. In fact, I would suggest that the notion of the individual is itself a very political one. And here's a big difference between Britain and the United States. You have a constitution. The First Amendment of your constitution directly deals with the issue of freedom of expression. We don't. If you try to impose a written constitution on the British public, I mean, that's the nearest way to get a rebellion, I think. Politicians have tried and failed to do it. But it does affect how you deal with this issue that you call censorship.
Well, you do have to watch out for these rebellions against the British Crown, John.
You can talk about the British Crown. There are certain things that we are not allowed to know about the British Crown. We're not allowed to ask questions about the financing of
I want
these things, and there is a form of censorship already in operation that a certain section of the public are allowed to benefit from.
Catherine, before we drift too far from this point, I want to raise with you the issue that for many, not just decades or for quite a long time, one of the sources of non-governmental censorship was religion, were various religions. And this was a very important force. It certainly was in the United States as well. Banned in Boston was a very meaningful term. And it was largely because of the strength of the Catholic Church in Boston that things were banned. So with the great changes in the attitudes toward and the roles of religion in our societies these days, how has that evolved?
I think one of the real problems that you can see with what we'd call censorship, let's stick with the Roman Catholic Church, and there has been censorship in the Roman Catholic Church in terms of attempts to shut down challenge, theological challenge, etc. What that leads to, I think, is a culture of secrecy. They don't want they haven't wanted to open the windows into the church. That started to change with the Second Vatican Council, but not as much as one might have hoped. And I think that culture leads it also to secrecy, and both forms of censorship and secrecy about the church was about trying to ensure that the laity were not scandalized. It's the attempts by the Catholic Church to limit discussion, to limit theological challenge has perhaps lessened, but nevertheless, there have been some people in recent times who've felt the power of the Vatican, they felt the hand on their collar, and if you experience that, it's extremely difficult. There was a Jesuit at one time Jacques Dupuy, who was effectively persecuted over his thinking on religious pluralism. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, really went after Dupuy. There's been a priest in more recent times, Irish priest Tony Flannery, who has challenged the Catholic Church on the ordination of women, which went down very badly, and he's still suspended for that, even in the papacy of Pope Francis. So they have used discipline to limit debate, and it's interesting that they excuse me, do that, because the Catholic Church at the same time has been very aware of how the media, how communication can also be used for your benefit. They got Marconian to help them with the wireless very early on in the days when wireless was being invented. They got involved with social media very early on, so they understand how powerful communication is, but at the same time, with certain individuals, they want to counter that communication.
And before we move on, we might want to remind our participants at a distance, if they want to submit questions, to use the Q&A button on Zoom. And this would be a good time to do it as we sort of round the corner of the half hour and look toward another part of our discussion in about 15-20 minutes or so. John Watson, I'm struck, I'm glad Kate Rowan brought up Section 230, and we live in this world where Section 230 purports to have solved a great deal and liberalized expression a great deal, but it strikes me that there may not be that much choice about really regulating social media, how to create a form of censorship that actually can occur quickly enough to have any impact is one of the big questions, without stationing some sort of arresting officers at every headquarters or something like that. Have our hands effectively been tied from reasserting any sort of control on social media?
I wouldn't say they have been tied, but I would say we have chosen to have them tied. In this country, we see a dichotomy between freedom and responsibility. Accordingly, and 230 represents this almost precisely, The more responsibility we place on you, the less freedom you have. And in the United States, anything that diminishes freedom for whatever purpose is frowned upon. But I see a greater value in responsible speech as compared to free speech. Unfettered expression has no value except to the individual who's expressing his or her views. For society in general, responsible expression has enormous social value. So when I say we chose to be put in a position of no choice, I'm saying, is this financial issue so great that we are willing to endure the harms of irresponsible expression? To date, the answer has been yes. We'd rather deal with this turmoil, with this ugliness, rather than place any sort of financial limitations on social media platforms. And John Drakakis, you mentioned earlier that there's no requirement that advertisements be truthful. Well, in the United States, advertisements have to be truthful. They lose absolutely all First Amendment protection if they are false and deceptive. Okay, so the United States Supreme Court and Congress have placed an extreme value on responsible advertising and totally abdicated responsibility for political speech, particularly when that political speech is in a political ad. An ad is, in terms of legal protection, is an inducement to engage in a commercial transaction. So if I'm selling you a pair of sneakers, I have to be truthful. But if I'm selling you a political idea, I can lie as much as I want. The Supreme Court has essentially said there's a First Amendment protection for political lies in the stolen valor cases. That's essentially what the Supreme Court says. So I argued in a now no longer published book that responsible speech is absolutely more important than free speech. We overvalue freedom and we misunderstand to a large extent what freedom actually is. I believe that actual absolute freedom is anarchy. If we share the planet with other people, our speech has to be responsible. Free expression has its place, but if you live alone on a planet, I say express the hell out of yourself. But there's at least one other human being on the planet. You need to be responsible if you want to have a proper relationship with that other person who inhabits the world with you.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Watson?
Yes.
Who decides what's responsible?
Yes,
Okay,
in that,
exactly,
I totally understand and agree that we should all
Exactly.
behave like people and responsibly with each other. But who decides is my question.
Okay, that is always the first criticism of this idea. And my answer is, who decides anything? In a democracy, the majority decides. In a dictatorship, the dictator decides. But it's a decision that has to be made consciously. And if you're afraid to make that decision, then you deserve the lack of responsible speech in return for freedom.
I'm afraid of the government making that decision when the government is led by people that don't agree with me, which it often is, because that's essentially licensed to censor speech. Because what I might say is, in the view of the people who disagree with me, irresponsible. How do we address or control for that in your version? And I'm sorry, Catherine, I'm done now.
Okay, well, I'd like to pick up on this as well. But firstly, going back to the advertising issue, that there are restrictions on advertising in the UK too. There's an outfit called the Advertising Standards Authority, which keeps an eye on claims made in ads. But in terms of responsibility, I think the waters are getting incredibly muddied now on what's considered acceptable or not, because we have got effectively partnerships developing between NGOs and the business world, which is helping to restrict what people can or can't say. So we've got an outfit like the Global Disinformation Index, which will help businesses work out whether or not they should advertise with a particular organization, depending on what that organization publishes. You know, they will use their algorithms to decide whether you shouldn't offer these publishing outfits your advertising revenue, because they've decided that a website or whatever should be blacklisted because of what it's been publishing. We've had an example in the UK of an organisation that is quite well respected, but has published some very well known gender critical academics, and they've had advertising blocked because of it. The British government was signed up to GDI at one time. I think they've now drawn back from it, but this kind of thing is starting to affect what people can write and what people can say.
One of the answers to Kate Ruan's question, which is a very good one, of course, is self-censorship. That in an educated, wise society, ultimately our recourse is to self-censorship. People knowing better, people respecting unwritten rules and standards of decency. My impression is that's not working very well right now. Others may disagree with me about that, and I don't think we can place much faith in self-censorship. Do you?
Sorry, is that a general question?
Yes.
Can I start on that? I mean, the idea of self-censorship is the control of oneself. Much of the self-censorship that we operate is actually subconscious. We're not conscious of it, but we do it. And it depends on, you know, what social groups we belong to or anything like that, that limits what we say. I mean, there's a decorum for this seminar, right? It wouldn't be difficult to violate it, but it would not be a good idea to do that. It would be counterproductive. And I think those of us who are academics tend always to spend our time, or part of our time, in questioning ourselves, in bringing the unconscious, the subconscious, up into our conscious behavior. But, you know, we can't apply that to everybody. I mean, John Watson was talking earlier on about, you know, the late 17th century and censorship, and saying that it was only for literate people. True. But also, of course, if you think of that, project that to the 21st century, we're now in a post-literate world. So that you know, the young people who, you know, live in accordance with the phones that they have in their hands. I don't know how to use one properly, so you know, I'm afraid I'm Neanderthal in this respect. But they're not illiterate at all. They can read, they can write, but they transform the language by virtue of the instrument that they're using. Now, it seems to me that we need to get under all of that before we can start thinking about censorship simply as the operation of power. I mean, at the root, censorship requires power to operate it. And the question is, in whose power? You know, what are their objectives? And how do they manipulate it?
Can I go to this idea of self-censorship?
Yeah.
I think that's a wrong conceptualization of what happens in what we consider to be self-censorship. I think I would choose to use a word like respecting others, because self-censorship means you're somehow restricting yourself. That's a negative action. But if you are speaking in a manner that is respectful of other people, that's a positive reaction. It's not self-censorship. Self-censorship assumes that we have these native negative impulses that we want to put out there in the universe. And I'm not sure that I agree with that as a basis for a discussion. I think that if we ground or replace the concept of self-censorship with ethical behavior, because I think ethics is at least 50% of what made the traditional news media responsible media, as opposed to the irresponsibility of social private media protected by Section 230. In this book I wrote years ago, I talked about how the news media are controlled by ethics and the law, and that controls their behavior. When the law is hands-off on social media and ethics is purely voluntary, that's where we have this Mad Max scenario in the media. Self-imposed ethical, moral respect for other people, I think that's a better way of looking at this issue, as opposed to urging people to self-censor. I don't assume people naturally have negative motives when they want to express an idea.
But you're assuming total consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Total consciousness, which of course is part of a very interesting political line on individualism, right?
I agree.
Here we have two cultures separated by a language, basically, because we would think of this rather differently. And it seems to me that in order to be able to understand what it is that we want to censor, we need to get at that unconscious in some ways. Not easy to do, not easy to do. And especially when you see some of the cases that are currently in the public eye.
Right. I want to bring up one case in the public eye very quickly before we turn to Mike Scott to discuss questions. And please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A button as soon as possible. But there's one incident recently which has scrambled a lot of definitions and a lot of our reactions to things. The dean of the law school at the University of California at Berkeley had a private dinner at his home to celebrate and honor high-achieving students who were about to graduate from law school. This dinner was invaded. I think the word invaded is not melodramatic here. Was burst into by people advocating a particular cause in the Middle East, pro-Palestinian demonstrators, and they demanded the right to speak, and they had chosen this as an occasion for reasons that can only be reasons of prejudice and discrimination. And the dean of the law school said that he was going to throw them out, that they did not have the entitlement to invade his private home and do this. And he said something that seems to me has needed to be said for quite a long time. He said, "You do not have freedom of speech in my house. I control who can speak in my house." And it was a sort of shockingly blunt statement. But he's become a hero for very informally drawing some lines on what he considered, and many would consider, hate speech and not responsible free speech, as you define it, John Watson. I think we're all yet to see what some of the consequences are of this stand that he took in this case. I don't know whether anyone else has been following this and wants to comment on it before we go back to Mike Scott.
It hasn't sort of really come into the news over here, but one issue I think is worth raising is the gap that we determine between public and private. I mean, it seems to me that people invading your own privacy is not quite the same thing as, you know, people making public statements from different positions. And again, I think that idea of it comes in as part of this notion of individuality that I'm thinking about. And it's much, much stronger, I sense, in the States than it is here. But I mean, is it stronger across the States, or is it strong only in relation to certain individuals or certain groups of individuals? I mean, the question I'd ask of your dean is that house provided by the organization for which he works? I mean, if he were a vice chancellor in Britain, he would have a house provided by the institution. So the question then would be whether this is private or public.
I don't have an answer to that.
Stanford,
to that
it's Stanford, right?
question.
Stanford's a private university.
No,
so
it was at Berkeley,
Berkeley,
which is
I'm
a
sorry.
public
So
university.
UCLA. All right.
But that's not to say that Berkeley provides the house. I have no reason to believe it. I must say, for somebody who has fancied myself more or less a free speech absolutist for a long time, I'm very relieved to have someone enunciate the notion of a private space where you can't dictate my agenda of what we're going to talk about, what we're going to think about, and what we're going to have for dinner. I just think, well, what we're going to have for dinner intellectually. And
I mean, one thing that you can say about that is that, I mean, Dean Chemerinsky is a constitutional law expert and has been for a long time. So far be it from me to say that to ever question that, but he was correct, right, in terms of existing precedent that the Supreme Court has held that you can actually restrict protest outside of a person's home to protect that privacy. So yes, he was right that he did not have to permit that speech, or really any speech, within his home.
Yeah, and the fact that the university owned that home, to me, is irrelevant. It's established as his residence, so his privacy would be exactly the same as if he owned the mortgage on that property.
No, it's absolutely.
And I don't know which is true.
Relevant. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but it would be absolutely relevant if this were a publicly owned house that he gets as part of his job. That's what muddies the water here, it seems to me. I don't know the answer to it, but
I think some people might. I don't know the answer either, John Drakakis, but I think some people might find some of those jobs less attractive if it means that anybody has to be able to say anything in their house, whether they're invited to say so or not. I see Michael Scott arriving to take our discussion to the next phase. Mike?
Well, I'm fascinated by what you just said, John, because as you know, I was a vice chancellor, and I certainly wasn't given a house. But there again, my university was a working class university, and I'm very proud of it as well. But there we are. But I do realise that in other places, vice chancellors are treated differently. Perhaps we ought to have a debate about that at some point. Kenneth Williams asks, healthy democracy depends on a well-informed public. How do we address intentional or unintentional manipulation of the public? Reference the previous conversation in which John Watson discussed responsible information and the over-evaluation of free speech to the point of irresponsible harm to fellow citizens. How do we convince people that unlimited freedom of speech is destructive and there must be limitations? And what would an effective and ethical process look like? Well, I mentioned you, John, so maybe you want to take that first.
Okay, so historically, the American press, the traditional legacy press, has placed a high value on truthful reporting. It was assumed that if the news media reported information that was not truthful, it would undermine democracy in that the people, when they voted, would not be making informed choices. Hence, the responsibility of the news media, pursuant to the First Amendment, was to provide reliable information that the people could use when they choose their government, which would ensure self-government and democracy. Okay. Over the past few years, we have learned that the First Amendment protects false information if it is not defamatory. We have also learned that people will pay for false information, notwithstanding there's a great deal of information out there indicating that what this news organization is providing is false. And I'm specifically referring to Fox News. I wrote about how Fox News, in reporting on the election fraud scandal with these voting machines, and Fox made a bunch of false claims that these voting machines were improperly rigged to give false counts. And it was proved that was not true. In depositions leading up to this libel lawsuit by the voting machine company, it came out that Fox knew some of the information it provided about the election was not true. And when they reported the truthful information, their viewership fell off a cliff. They began rebroadcasting corrected, incorrect information, and the viewership climbed again. So the assumption that people want the truth is no longer viable in terms of marketing. So it may sound like we need to restrict freedom, but I prefer to say we need to find a way to make sure information has to be responsible and reliable when it comes from the news media.
Except that truth is not a uniform phenomenon. There are truths now. In other words, truth is now multiple. And that's the problem. That's
journalism is about collecting and presenting the best evidence of the truth. And if you define truth as that which is supported by the best and most credible evidence, you'd see fewer truths.
You might, but the problem is defining what that kind of truth is. I mean, for example, newspapers are notorious for this. I mean, there are lots of court cases over the past years in which newspapers themselves have been shown to be, institutions, been shown to be biased in one way or another. And of course, it depends on who owns the press.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. But
So,
I think that a rational decision can be made about which is the best evidence that this particular thing is the truth. Now, bias, believe it or not, has nothing to do with truth. Bias is another choice altogether.
But I think there are a lot of, I'm talking about Britain now. I mean, I don't know the newspaper industry in the States, but in the UK, bias is accepted as the norm. And even the BBC can be accused of bias.
Yeah.
Now what happens, of course, is that the right in the UK now attacks these institutions as being left and liberal. And there are certain, the Guardian is mocked because it's a bit too serious. The Daily Mail, well, that's a different proposition altogether. And the Sun, well, the Sun is not known for truth. So it seems to me that we're in a situation here where it's very, very difficult to determine what the truth is, even if you're there. If you're actually in the situation that's being reported. And
could I interject
Catherine,
here? I'm not sure if anybody else on the panel has worked as a journalist. I think, John Watson, you said you were once a journalist, but I've been a journalist for 40 odd years. And it sounds very noble if you talk about journalists being great champions of the truth. And I imagine that quite a lot of journalists go into journalism wanting to be champions of the truth. But actually, journalism in many ways isn't about the truth. It's about stories. And what makes your story isn't just about who your proprietor is or who your what your political view of the world is. It's also about who your readers are. And you, as a journalist, you will focus on a story according to what you believe your readers are interested in. So you may call that bias, but I think it's something that we should bear in mind, and that leads, of course, to what you might call self-censorship. That a news website or a newspaper or whatever will decide to run a particular story because they believe it's something that will interest their readers, and they leave something else out because they think it won't. And you may call that a form of censorship, but I think we need to remember that journalism is about stories.
Can I interject a bit respectfully? Journalism is about collecting the best evidence of the truth. Okay. Bias is unavoidable if there are human beings in the equation. What we refer to objectivity is actually the proper bias. Journalism isn't about storytelling. I don't consider novelists to be journalists. I don't consider.
If you work in a newsroom, I'm not sure when you last worked in a newsroom. If you work in a newsroom and you go up to your news editor and you say, I've got this information that shows that the Prime Minister has been taking money from this business, the news editor doesn't go, what a great truth that is. They say it's a great story, and that affects how journalists think. That's the point I'm trying to make. It doesn't mean that they aren't interested in the truth, but it does affect how they see the world. Or they go to the news editor with a story, and the news editor says, our readers aren't interested in that. Don't bother writing it. So journalism is affected by, I'm not saying we are dealing with fiction, but we have this sense of things that interest people. And so we write them, and truth comes into that because a lot of people are interested in the truth. They want to know what's going on in Gaza, but they have ways of conveying that and ways of not conveying those bits of information that they have.
If this
Sandy,
reporter were at the golf,
can I just sorry, John, can I bring Sandy in, because Sandy's worked in newsrooms all his life, really. Well, a lot of his life. What's your experience? Is that the same experience in the States?
Yes, thank you, Mike. I've been a journalist for so long that I still regard myself as a journalist, even when I'm meant to be doing other jobs. And I have found what drew me to journalism, quite honestly, more years ago than I'd like to admit, is that it was the one way I knew of and could discover to try to do what John Watson describes as the purpose of journalism, which is to find the best representation of the truth of what was happening. Of course, I was subject to bias. I think that's important to admit, but I never knowingly tilted the story in decades, and too many decades to admit, because of those biases. But without journalism and without a free and robust press, media, I don't think democracy can or will survive. It is the one. It is more reliable at this point than the judiciary in this country as a way of establishing what's really happened and what the truth is. But it's threatened. It's severely threatened. It makes this our subject today all the more urgent in my view.
Because the thing that the area that so far has been more or less sidelined is the fact that both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, this year is very special because there's going to be an election. Now, what has been demonstrated in the United Kingdom over plebiscite about Brexit was that a pack of lies were being told by people, absolute lies, by people who were going to be prime minister, absolute lies. You know, I wouldn't comment about because I don't know enough about the US, but I do see various people, two people who are going for president. I don't know whether they're telling lies, but some people imply that they're telling lies. What do you do as a in the newsroom about this? About at the moment you've got a president who's up in court. And it's all, what is the truth? What is the lie? I don't know. Catherine, what's your view of that?
I'd be interested to hear what John Watson has to say about this, and Catherine as an experienced journalist, but the system is certainly put to the test by the situations in both the UK and the United States this year. The survival of a system of responsible discussion of public affairs in a true framework. And it's demonstrable that this has not always been the case in recent years in either place.
The political system in the United States has fundamentally changed the practice of journalism in the United States. I've only been a journalist for 21 years, and I still work at the investigative reporting at the Washington Post. But when I was a reporter, first 10 years of my life as a reporter, we were not allowed to refer to anyone as a liar. We were not allowed to indicate that someone is a racist. Over the last 7 years, some of the most responsible news organizations in the United States now regularly use that terminology because the political landscape has changed such that politicians can lie and they can get away with it. So in the current political scenarios that we are living through, journalism is going to change even more. And journalism is not going to be the only voice influencing the outcome of the elections. There are these other non-responsible media entities that will have a large say in the outcome of these elections. And that's sort of frightening, but I mean, in the name of freedom, we really don't have any choice. So we might want to start thinking about responsibility as opposed to freedom.
Catherine?
Yeah, I'm just talking about elections and political reporting. When it comes to politics, we have political ideas, we have policy, and we have personality. Now, particularly with the kind of system such as you have in the United States, personality, or should I say character, really matters. We really want to know about people's character. The difficulty, I think, with the kind of news reporting that we have nowadays is that there is such a focus on personality or character. We're influenced in a way as journalists by the cult of celebrity, that there's not enough attention paid to policy and a lack of scrutiny. And that's perhaps not so much about censorship as about choices made about journalism. Or perhaps sometimes it is down to censorship because politicians perhaps are reluctant to engage as fully as they should, helping journalists scrutinise policy. The other thing that's happened in the UK, and I don't know if this has happened in the United States, and will really have an impact when it comes to our next general election, is that the part of the media that has suffered to a huge extent in recent times, in terms of economics, in terms of the impact of social media, etc., the impact of the algorithms that outfits like Google use, is the local media. It's a disaster zone, and our next big election, our general election, will be fought on TV, it'll be fought in social media, but when it comes to coverage at the local level, when it comes to electing your local member of parliament, the scrutiny won't be there in the way it once was. So people's access to information will be really limited, and that's a huge problem.
Can I take that up? We're getting short of time now, but there's something I thought was really important being asked here by Natasha Kinmont. How, and it relates in a sense to where you're going on this, Catherine. How does censorship look for youth pre-college age in school systems? Specifically, who is the deciding authority on who is to be censored? Kate, you want to go on that? Youth?
Sure, I'll try it. Generally speaking, here, the deciding authority on censorship in schools is the school. The schools generally have rules that in universities, it's codes of conduct. And some of those can talk about the types of speech that are and aren't permitted on campus. And in elementary, middle, and high schools in the United States, there could be much stronger censorship policies. But we do have a long line of Supreme Court cases that essentially boil down to the idea that students do not lose their First Amendment rights at the door of the school.
Right.
The school has greater authority to restrict speech, to censor speech within the school in service of the school's educational mission. So if you're doing something that interrupts the school's operation, the school has more authority to decide what can and can't be said and when it can and can't be said. But if you, for example, like Mary Beth Tinker want to wear a particular piece of clothing in protest of the Vietnam War, the school cannot stop you from doing those things. That was First Amendment protected activity. Also, the school cannot necessarily control what you say out of school. Outside of school, there was a recent Supreme Court case dealing with a Snapchat that was sent by a high schooler where she was complaining about not making the cheer squad. And she used some very colorful language in that chat. The school became aware of what she had said, and they disciplined her for using inappropriate language at school, except she hadn't done it at school. She had only done it about school. And the Supreme Court said, actually, no, you cannot punish children for what they say. The school does not have jurisdiction to punish children for what they say outside of school. So yes, there is stronger ability to censor students within schools in the United States, all the way up into college. But that does not mean that students completely lose their free expression rights simply because they are at school. There are protections for free speech in schools.
Okay, thanks for that.
Can I ask
very quickly, John, because we're running out of time.
What about what students read? What constraints placed upon what they read?
Okay, this is a really important question, right? So right in the United States right now, there are a lot of states that are attempting to ban books within schools, attempting to stop kids from being able to read books that the government doesn't like, books that address topics that the government thinks are not appropriate for children to address. And by and large, these bans are affecting authors of color, LGBTQ authors, and topics that generally kind of like make certain government officials uncomfortable. At one point, I believe in Tennessee, the Bible was banned from children being able to read it in schools. These are actually really hard laws to challenge because they're often regulations of what schools can and cannot show, and it's like the government regulating itself because it generally applies to public school districts. So these can be really hard, but really hard from a legal challenge perspective. But from a censorship perspective, an organization that I used to work for called PEN America essentially tracks book bans across the country and does its best to challenge as many of them as possible or prevent them from coming into effect, because it's a significant concern. The thing that I think about
I'm going to have to stop
every
you
kid
now.
deserves to see themselves in the books that they read, and that is part of what these laws do is it prevents kids from seeing themselves in the things that they read.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We got into a terrific discussion towards the end, but I have to start to bring it to a close. Sandy, is there anything finally you want to say?
I just want to thank everyone who helps us put these discussions together, Mike. I think we're up and around number 43 or 44 consecutive months that we've had these programs now on Zoom and with global reach, and it's very satisfying. I'm particularly grateful to our panelists today, all of whom brought some very important observations and experience to the topic, and grateful to the people at Georgetown University who sponsor and support this no matter what we say. We are not censored.
Well, thanks to you, Sandy, and for everything you do in terms of this series. But thanks to our panelists today, Catherine, John Trekakis, John Watson, and Kate Rowan, Catherine Perpensa. Thank you all very much. It was a terrific discussion. The next free speech project of the Crossroads International Dialogues in association with the Future of the Humanities Project will be on Wednesday, June the 12th. It will be at 11 a.m. EST and 4 p.m. in the UK. And we'll be discussing the United Nations and its role, particularly in the present climate and what is going to happen. I also want to mention, with a little humility, a Zoom on Monday the 20th of May, when Michael Scott, which happens to be me, will be discussing Hamlet and Twelfth Night in the series Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference. And it'll be Hamlet and Twelfth Night encountering death. An interesting thing, interesting plays of 1601. So that will be me on Monday the 20th of May in the Cultural Encounters series, 11 a.m. EST and 4 p.m. In the UK. My thanks also to the colleagues at Georgetown, particularly the President and also the Vice President of Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. At Blackfriars, to John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute. The Campion Hall, to Nick Austin. I'd like to thank all those of you who've asked questions. You put them in a little late, I'm afraid, but we tried to get through some of the questions at least. Thank you all for attending today and for your support for our various series, especially Sandy. Just one little thing. My mother told me when I was very small, if you tell a lie, you have to live by it. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or on LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until the next time, take care, keep safe, and thank you again. What a terrific discussion.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.